On the coldest night the valley had ever known, every fire was dying. Behind every door, families pressed close to failing stoves, watching their breath turn to mist inside their own homes. The cold did not knock. It crept through every crack, every seam, patient and hungry, and certain it would win. But out in the frozen dark, one light refused to go out. A single squat tower of gray stone glowed faintly through the storm, warm somehow, impossibly warm, while the whole world turned to ice around it. And through the killing wind, a figure was fighting his way across the white, an old man bent against the storm, carrying something in his arms, something that was almost too cold to save. They had laughed at him once. They had called him a fool. They had bet against him, every last one of them. And on this night, the coldest night any of them would ever live to remember, they were about to learn just how wrong a whole valley of certain men could be. But to understand that night, you have to go back to the autumn before, back to the day a stranger came to the valley with nothing in his wagon but his tools, and nothing in his eyes but a grief he never spoke aloud. The wind came down from the high country before the first snow ever did. It came early that autumn, thin and sharp, the kind of wind that found the seams in a coat and slipped inside like a thief. And along the rutted track that climbed up into the valley, a single wagon came slowly on. It was an old wagon, its canvas patched and gray, its wheels worn thin from too many miles. The horse that pulled it was old too, head low, breath clouding in the cold air, putting one tired hoof in front of the other the way a creature does when it has long since stopped asking how much farther. And on the seat sat a man. He was bundled against the cold, but his eyes were the part of him that the few who saw him pass would remember. Pale, steady, looking at the valley the way a man looks at a thing he has traveled a very long way to find. He pulled the wagon to the top of the rise, and he stopped. And he looked down at the place that would be his home, a fold of land where two ridges leaned together like cupped hands, a scatter of cabins, smoke rising from their chimneys, a few thin fields already going brown, and all around the dark green of the pines climbing the slopes, and above them the white teeth of the mountains where the wind was born. He sat there a long while, looking. He was not admiring it. He was reading it, the way the land lay, where the wind would press, where the cold would gather, and where it would not. And then he clicked his tongue at the old horse, and the wagon rolled down into the valley, and the man who would change that place forever arrived, so quietly that hardly anyone noticed he had come at all. His name was Ewan Hale. He was 52 years old. His hair had gone the gray of a winter sky. His face was lined the way old leather is lined, by weather and by work, and by the slow passing of more hard years than easy ones. His hands, when he finally climbed down from that wagon, were the hands of a man who had spent his whole life shaping hard things, thick-knuckled, scarred, and stronger than they had any right to be. He had crossed an ocean. He had crossed a country. He had come from a far mountainous land on the other side of the sea, a place of stone walls and stone houses and winters so cruel they had a habit of teaching men everything they would ever need to know about death. And he had arrived in that valley with almost nothing. A wagon, its wheels worn thin, That tired old horse, a few worn tools wrapped in oilcloth, a canvas roll of clothes, and a silence so deep that the people of the settlement did not quite know what to make of him. He did not come to them with stories. He did not come asking for anything. He came the way the autumn wind came, quietly from somewhere far away, carrying the chill of distant places. They were a small community, no more than 40 souls, scattered across that fold of land. They were good people, hard-working people. They had come to that valley themselves, most of them, only a few short years before. They had cleared the land. They had broken the soil. They had buried a few of their own already in a small fenced plot at the edge of the settlement, and they had learned the hard, simple truths of a hard, simple place. They knew how to fell a tree and square a log. They knew how to chink the gaps with mud and moss, how to seal a wall with whatever pitch the pines would give them, how to feed an iron stove through a long, cold night. They knew the way things were done, and the way things were done was wood. There was wood everywhere a man looked, tall pines marching up the ridges, stands of fir thick as a man's waist, a whole valley of timber, free for the felling, ready to be turned into walls and roofs, and the great hungry fires that those walls and roofs were built to hold. Why would any man build with anything else? When the old man first came among them, they were courteous enough. They offered him a place to water his horse. A few asked in the careful way of frontier people where he was bound and what trade he kept. He told them he was a mason. A few eyebrows rose at that. A mason in a valley of trees. But they were busy people, with a winter bearing down on them, and a quiet old stranger who kept to himself was no trouble to anybody. So they nodded, and they went back to their axes, and they did not think much more about him. Not yet. So that autumn, while the rest of the valley filled the air with the sound of work, the old man walked the land alone. For days he did nothing that anyone could see but walk. He paced the fields. He climbed the lower slopes. He knelt and dug his bare fingers into the half-frozen earth, testing it, tasting it almost. He found a level rise 2 miles west of the settlement, where the ground was firm and the water would drain away clean. And there, in the middle of a wide, empty clearing, the old man knelt at last in the frozen grass. His hands were bare. In that cold, every other soul in the valley had their hands wrapped in wool or buried deep in their pockets. But his were bare, and they moved slowly across the surface of a single gray stone, feeling it the way a man might feel the face of someone he loved. He turned the stone over. He set it down. He turned it again. And only when it sat exactly the way he wanted it to, did he let it rest in the earth. That was the first stone. There would be thousands more. Now, a woman watched all of this from the edge of her own doorway. She was younger than Ewan, a widow herself, with a son who could not have been more than 8 years old. Her name was Maren Voss. She had lost her husband the winter before. A fever, swift and cruel, that no amount of nursing could turn. 1 week he had been splitting wood in the yard, strong and laughing. The next he was in the cold ground at the edge of the settlement, and she was a widow with a small boy and a small cabin and a whole hard world to face alone. She knew what it was to be looked at now, the way the valley looked at the old man, not unkindly, but from a distance, as if loss were a thing that might be catching. The other women had been good to her in the early days. They had brought food. They had sat with her. But grief is a long road, far longer than anyone expects. And after a few months, the casseroles stopped coming, and the visits grew rare. And a widow with a child learned that the world expects you to be done with your sorrow long before your sorrow is done with you. So she understood something about that kind of quiet, the quiet that settles over a person who has buried someone they were not finished loving. And she saw it in the old stonemason. She saw the way he worked alone, the way he never argued, the way he carried his grief, the way he carried his stones, carefully, deliberately, as if setting it down too fast might break something. And she wondered about him. Her boy, Silas, wondered too, but the way children wonder, out loud, without shame. "Mama?" the boy asked one morning, watching the distant figure in the field. "Why is the old man building with rocks?" And Marin did not have an answer. Not yet. But she looked at the old man, bent alone over his stones, while the whole valley filled the air with the sound of axes. And something in her chest pulled toward him, the way one lonely thing will always recognize another. To understand the rocks, you would have had to understand the winter that had taken everything from him. It had happened across the sea, in the years before he ever thought of crossing it. He had been a younger man then, a married man. Her name had been Elspeth, and she had a laugh that could fill a room and warm it better than any fire. She used to tease him about his silences. She used to say that he saved up his words, like a miser saves coins, and spent them only when the world had truly earned them. He had met her at a market fair, a lifetime ago, when he was a young mason with stone dust in his hair, and not 2 coins to rub together. She had been selling wool at her father's stall, and she had caught him staring, and instead of looking away, she had laughed at him, bright and unafraid, and asked if he meant to buy something, or only to stand there like one of his own walls. He had married her within the year. He had loved her more than he had ever known how to say. They had lived in a small house, a wooden house, in a valley not so very different from this one. He had built it himself, with the cocky confidence of a younger man who thought he knew everything there was to know. He had been a stonemason even then. He knew, even as a young man, what his grandfather had taught him about stone. But stone took time, and they had been young, and in a hurry to begin their life. So he had done what everyone did. He had built in wood, fast, warm enough, good enough. Good enough. Those were the 2 words that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Because one winter, the cold came down from the mountains the way it always did. Only that year, it did not leave. It settled. It sank its teeth in. The snow rose past the windows. The wind never stopped. The world outside their little wooden house turned white and silent and merciless, and the days grew so short they were hardly days at all. And night after night, he fed the fire and watched the warmth slip away through the cracks in the walls as fast as he could make it. Wood gives heat, but wood does not hold it. The moment the flame dies, the warmth begins to leave. Through every gap, every joint, every seam the cold can find, and the cold can always find them. He learned that the hard way. He learned it in the dark, with Elspeth growing weaker beside him, the cold sinking into her bones in a way he could not warm out of them. No matter how high he built the fire, no matter how close he held her. She had been sick to begin with, a cough that deepened, And the cold did what the cold does to the sick and the weak and the old. It found her, and it would not let go. The fire was never quite enough. The walls were never quite tight enough. And the morning was never quite warm enough. He remembered the last night most of all, how he had burned the very last of the wood, how he had pulled every blanket they owned over her and lain down beside her and wrapped himself around her and tried with the whole failing furnace of his own body to give her the warmth their house could not. She had been awake near the end. She had taken his hand in both of hers and held it to her cheek, and she had not spoken of being afraid. She had only said very softly, "You're warm. You're always so warm." And he had held her tighter and promised her the morning would be better. He remembered the wind, that long, low, endless howl that did not rise and fall, but simply held, hour after hour, like a held breath that would not be let go. And he remembered the morning, the terrible, silent, sunlit morning, when he woke and the fire was ash and the cold had won, and Elspeth was gone. She had slipped away in the night, quietly, the way she did everything, without a word so as not to wake him. The house that was supposed to protect her could not. And in the terrible silence that followed, kneeling on a cold floor in a cold room in a house made of wood, a thought took root in him that he would carry across an ocean and a country and into the rest of his life. Wood betrays. Wood gives you light and comfort and the illusion of safety. And then, on the coldest night, when you need it most, it lets the warmth slip through your fingers and out into the dark. But stone was different. He had seen it as a boy, in the old houses of the old country, the thick-walled cottages where his grandfather had lived. The way those walls held the heat of a small fire through an entire frozen night, and were still warm to the touch when the sun came up. Stone did not give warmth easily, but once it took the warmth in, it remembered. It held that heat the way the heart holds a memory, slowly, stubbornly, long after the fire was gone. Stone remembers warmth. That became the truth he built his life around. He could not save Elspeth. That was done, and no grief of his would ever undo it. But he could spend the rest of his days making sure that no one else, under any roof of his, would ever freeze in the dark the way she had. And so he had sold what little he had, and packed his tools, and crossed an ocean and a country, looking for a place cold enough and far enough that a man might begin again. A place that needed what he knew. He found it in that valley, where two ridges leaned together like cupped hands, and 40 souls were busy building their wooden houses against a winter they did not yet truly understand. He was not building a house. He was building a promise made to a woman who could no longer hear it, a promise that no one under his roof would ever again freeze in the dark while the warmth slipped away. But promises are easy to make alone in a field. They are harder to defend in front of 40 people who think you have lost your mind. The first night, before he had moved more than a handful of stones, the old man sat alone at the edge of his clearing as the light failed. He had paced off the circle by then. He had driven a stake into the center and tied a length of cord to it and walked the cord around, scratching a great ring into the frozen earth. A round house, just as his grandfather had taught him. He sat on an overturned bucket and looked at that ring in the fading light. and he listened to the distant ring of the valley's axes finally falling silent as the dark came on. He was tired in a way that sleep did not touch. And for a moment, sitting there in the cold, he let himself feel the full weight of how alone he was. A stranger, an old man, a foreigner with a strange accent and a stranger idea in a place where he knew no one and no one knew him. He could have built a cabin like everyone else. He had the skill. It would have been faster. It would have been easier. No one would have laughed. But he looked at that ring in the earth, and he thought of Elspeth, and he knew he could not. "All right," he said quietly, to no one, to the cold, to the dark, to the memory of a woman an ocean away. "All right, we begin." The trouble began in earnest the day he stood before the settlement's council. It was late in the season. The leaves had gone. The mornings had teeth. And every able man in the valley was racing the snow, trying to get 4 walls and a roof up before the first heavy fall. There was no time to waste. And there was certainly no time for the strange old stonemason and his strange ideas. But he asked to speak. And because they were, at heart, decent people, they let him. The council met in a long, low room where the men gathered, with a fire in an iron stove at one end, and the smell of pine smoke and wet wool thick in the air. The old man stood at the front of that room, his weathered hands folded in front of him, and he laid out his plan in a low, steady voice that still carried the music of the old country. A tower, he told them, round, built of stone, walls 2 feet thick. A firebox set not against a wall, but in the very center of the room. "It will hold the heat," he said, "longer than any cabin any of you has ever lived in. It will keep your families warm through the longest night the winter can throw at you. And it will do it on a fraction of the wood you are all out there cutting." For a moment, no one spoke. The fire popped in the stove. And then someone laughed. It was a small laugh at first, a single startled bark from somewhere in the back. But laughter in a cold room full of tired men is a contagious thing. It spread, and out of the middle of it stepped a man named Hollis Boone. Hollis Boone was a master carpenter, and he knew it. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with forearms like the limbs of the trees he felled. He had spent the better part of 30 years building homes, and there was not a joint or a beam or a timber frame in that valley that he could not have raised in his sleep. He was proud of his trade, and he had every right to be. Half the cabins in that valley stood because of his hands, and pride, when it is challenged, rarely keeps quiet. "Stone," Hollis Boone said, and he let the word hang in the air like something distasteful. He folded his thick arms across his chest. "You'll freeze to death, old man." The laughter quieted, just a little, the way a room quiets when it senses a fight. "Stone draws the cold," Boone went on, warming to it now, playing to the crowd. "Lay your hand on a stone wall in the dead of winter and tell me what you feel. It pulls the warmth right out of you, right out of your skin." A few men nodded. "You don't need rock," Boone said. "You need wood. You need insulation. You need a layer of still air between you and the cold. Not a pile of stones stacked up like a grave marker." That word landed. A grave marker. Some of the men chuckled again. One of them, a homesteader named Amos Dunn, shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at someone too foolish to be helped. Amos Dunn was a lean, weathered man with 3 hard winters in that valley behind him, and the certainty of a man who has survived exactly long enough to think he knows everything. "I've spent winters in this country," Amos Dunn said. "Real winters. I burn 6 cords of wood a year just to keep my family from freezing, and that's with proper chinking and a good iron stove." He looked at Ewan the way you might look at a child who insists the moon is made of bread. You build a stone box and light a fire in the middle of it. You'll be burning 10 cords, if you live that long. More laughter. And through all of it, Ewan Hale said nothing. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He stood very still, his bare, weathered hands folded in front of him, and he let the laughter wash over him like cold rain over old stone. Because here is the thing about a man who has stood in a freezing room beside someone he loved and watched the warmth leave them. There is very little that a roomful of laughter can do to him. He had heard worse silences than this. When the room finally quieted, he lifted his eyes, and he looked, not at Hollis Boone, not at Amos Dunn, but at the whole gathering, slowly, one face at a time. "I won't ask any of you to build with me," he said. His voice was soft, but in the hush of that room, it carried. "I won't ask you to believe me. Belief is a thing that has to be earned, and I haven't earned it yet." He paused. "But I would ask one thing." The room waited. "When the winter comes," he said, "and it will come, harder than you think. When it comes, don't watch my tower hoping I'm a fool." He let that settle. "Watch it hoping I'm not." And then he nodded once. He thanked them for their time, with a courtesy that the laughter had not earned. And he turned and walked out into the cold. Behind him, the room was quiet for a moment. And then someone made a joke, and the laughter started up again. But not everyone laughed. In the back of the room, a man named Josiah Pryor sat with his arms folded and his eyes narrowed, watching the door long after the stonemason had gone through it. Josiah Pryor was an older man, quiet by nature, a keeper of records and a counter of things. He had served as a quartermaster once, in another life, supplying men in hard places, and he had learned in that work a simple truth, that the world did not care what you believed about it. The world only cared what was true. And the only way to find out what was true was to measure it carefully and to keep your opinions to yourself until the measuring was done. He had buried a wife of his own years back and a brother and more men than he liked to count, and the burying had worn the loud certainties right out of him. What was left was a quiet man who trusted very little that he had not seen with his own eyes. He did not laugh, because in all the noise of that room, he had noticed something the others had missed. The old stonemason had not boasted. He had not promised to be the smartest man in the valley. He had not claimed to know better than the carpenter or the homesteader. He had only said, "Watch." And in Josiah Pryor's long experience, the men who said watch were far more dangerous than the men who said trust me. He tucked that thought away, the way he tucked everything away. And he decided quietly that when the snow came, he would do exactly that. He would watch. The next morning, the old stonemason went back to his field, and he began. First came the foundation, not a simple thing set on top of the earth, but a ring of stone sunk deep into the ground, packed underneath with gravel so the frost could not heave it up and crack it apart through the long winter. It was slow work, brutally slow. Each stone had to be lifted, and these were not small stones. Some weighed as much as a grown man's leg. He moved them one at a time from a ridge 2 miles to the north, hauling them on a sledge behind that tired old horse, then setting them by hand. Lift, carry, set, turn it, feel it. Find the face that wanted to face the world, and the face that wanted to nestle against its neighbor. And then, the next one. A man half his age would have struggled with the work. He was past 50, and his back ached at the end of every day, and his hands cracked and bled in the cold. But he did not stop. He had a rhythm, and the rhythm did not care how old he was. While he worked, the valley around him hurried. The cabins went up fast, the way wooden things do. In a matter of days, a man could raise 4 walls and throw a roof over them and call it a home. By the time Ewan Hale had finished sinking his foundation into the ground, his neighbors were hanging their doors and cutting their windows and stacking their cords of wood as high as a man could reach. They watched him as they worked. Some of them stopped to stare. Some shook their heads. A trapper named Calder Foster, a wiry, restless man who was rarely in one place for long, slowed his horse on his way to check his lines and looked at the slow, patient old man bent over his ring of stone in the cold. "He's building a monument to his own stubbornness," Calder Foster said to no one in particular. And he rode on, but the old man did not stop. He did not seem to hear them at all. Lift, carry, set, day after day after day. And as the first real snow began to threaten on the northern horizon, the walls of the tower slowly began to rise. There was one person who did not laugh. The boy. Silas Voss had taken to wandering out to the edge of the field in the gray afternoons, when his chores were done, to watch the old man work. He never came too close. He was a careful child, the way children who have lost a father often become. He had learned, young, that the world could take things away without warning, and a part of him was always braced for the next loss. But he watched. He watched the way the old man chose each stone, turning it over and over until it satisfied some private rule the boy could not see. He watched the way the walls grew, not in a straight line like everyone else's, but in a great slow curve, like the rim of a giant bowl rising up out of the earth. And one cold afternoon, the boy could not hold the question in any longer. "Why round?" he called out across the frozen grass. The old man stopped. He straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back, and he turned to look at the boy standing at the edge of his field with his thin coat and his red cheeks and his enormous, serious eyes. For a long moment, Ewan Hale did not answer. And then, something happened that the valley had not seen since the strange old man arrived. He smiled. It was small. It was tired, but it was real. "Come here," he said. The boy hesitated. Then he came. The old man knelt down, slow and careful, until he was level with the child. He picked up a small round river stone from a pile near his feet, a smooth gray thing about the size of an apple, and he held it out. "Feel that," he said. The boy took it. He turned it over in his small hands, the way he had seen the old man do. "It's cold," the boy said. "Aye, cold now." The old man closed the boy's fingers gently around the stone. But hold it. Keep it in your hands a while. And what happens? The boy frowned, thinking, It gets warm? It takes the warmth from your hands, the old man said softly, slowly. And then he tapped the back of the boy's small fist. It keeps it, long after you've put it down, long after the fire's gone out. The boy looked down at the stone in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. A round room, the old man went on, rising again with a quiet grunt, has no cold corners for the warmth to hide in. The heat moves in a circle, round and round, touching everything, leaving nothing out in the cold. He looked out at the curving wall. A wooden house keeps the cold out for a while, he said. But the moment the fire dies, it forgets how to be warm. He laid his bare hand against the stone. This won't forget. The boy stood there a long moment, the river stone warm now in his small fist. And then he asked the question that no one else in the whole valley had thought to ask. Will it keep my mama warm? The old man went very still. Something moved behind his eyes. Something old and deep and painful. The ghost of another winter. Another house. Another person he had not been able to keep warm. He looked down at the boy, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. If she'll let it, he said. Aye, it will. The boy nodded, satisfied in the way only children can be. He slipped the warm stone into his coat pocket, as if it were a treasure, and he ran home across the frozen field to tell his mother about the round house that would not forget how to be warm. The old man watched him go. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence around him did not feel quite so empty. The snow came at last in the first week of true cold. It came soft at first, fat, drifting flakes that the children chased with open hands. The valley looked, for a day, like something out of a story, white and clean and gentle. But the old man knew better. He had seen snow that looked gentle. He had seen what it could become. So while his neighbors finished their cabins and settled in by their stoves, content and warm and certain they had beaten the season, Ewan Hale worked faster. The cold did not arrive all at once after that. It came the way grief comes, in small advances. A morning a little harder than the last, a wind that bit a little deeper, frost that lingered in the shadows long after the sun had climbed, and through all of it, the old man worked. There is a rhythm to laying stone that most people never learn, because most people never have the patience to find it. Lift, carry, set, step back, look, listen almost to what the wall is telling you, then lift again. Ewan Hale had been finding that rhythm for more years than the boy who watched him had been alive. His hands knew it without being told. His shoulders knew it. Even on the days when his old body ached so badly that rising from his cot in the morning felt like an argument. His hands remembered what to do, and so the tower rose, not quickly, never quickly. A wooden house goes up in a shout, a stone one goes up in a whisper, but it rose. Now the thing that no one in the valley understood, the thing they could not see by standing at the edge of the field and laughing, was that the old man was not simply stacking rocks on top of each other. He was building something far stranger than that. He built the walls in two skins, an inner wall of fitted stone and an outer wall, and between them a packed core of smaller stones and a mortar he mixed by hand from lime and clay. It was slow, filthy, freezing work. His neighbors had their walls up in days. He spent those same days on his knees in the cold, working that gray paste into every gap and seam with his bare fingers, because he did not trust a trowel to feel what his fingers could feel. The boy came every day now. He had appointed himself, in the quiet way of children, to the old man's side, and the old man had not sent him away. He came at first only to watch. Then, one afternoon, when the old man's arms were full and a stone was about to slip, the boy darted in without being asked and braced it with his small body until the old man could set it right. The old man looked at him for a long moment after that. "Steady hands," he said. It was the highest praise the boy had ever been given by anyone. And from that day, the boy was no longer a watcher. He was a helper. "Why 2 walls?" the boy asked him one gray afternoon, as he mixed the mortar the way the old man had shown him, his small face screwed up in concentration. And the old man, kneeling in the cold, with his hands gray to the wrist, thought about how to answer. "When you were small," he said slowly, "and the night was cold. What did your mother do?" The boy thought. "She wrapped me up," he said, "in blankets. Lots of them." "Aye," the old man nodded. "Not one thick blanket. Layers, with a little air trapped between." He patted the wall. "This is the same. The inside wall takes the warmth from the fire. The outside wall faces the cruel world. And the middle," he pressed his palm flat against the stone, "the middle holds the warmth in the dark, so it doesn't run away to where it isn't wanted." The boy frowned, working it through. "So the wall is wearing a coat," he said finally. And the old man laughed. It surprised them both, that laugh. Rough and unused, like a door on a hinge that had been shut too long. "Aye, lad," he said. "That's it exactly. The wall is wearing a coat." He had learned all of this a long time ago, of course, not from books. He had little use for books. He had learned it as a boy himself, in the old country across the sea, at the side of an old man with hands even more weathered than his own. His grandfather, he could still see him if he closed his eyes. A great gray-bearded figure, bent over a wall in the cold, with the same patience the whole valley now mistook for foolishness. He remembered being small, no older than Silas was now, handing his grandfather stones from a pile, learning the weight of them, learning the way a good stone settled and a bad stone wobbled. He remembered the old man's hands, scarred and strong, showing him how to find the true face of a stone. "Everything has a face it wants to show the world, lad," his grandfather used to say. "Your work is only to find it and let it." He remembered, too, the long winter evenings inside his grandfather's stone cottage, the wind screaming outside, while inside the air was soft and warm, and the walls gave back the heat of a small fire all night long. He remembered falling asleep with his cheek against the warm stone, safe, while the storm beat itself to pieces against the other side. He had not understood then what kept him warm. He only knew that in his grandfather's house the cold could not reach him. It had taken a lifetime and a terrible loss for him to understand that the warmth had not been magic. It had been wisdom, old, patient, hard-won wisdom, passed down through more generations than anyone could count. The old country had no soft winters. It had only stone and the cold and the long, hard wisdom of people who had buried enough of their own to learn how to keep the living warm. His grandfather had taught him a saying in the old tongue that did not translate cleanly, but it meant something close to this. The fire is a guest. The stone is the host. A guest comes and goes. A guest is bright and warm and full of life. And then, in the morning, a guest is gone. But the host remains. The host remembers the warmth of the guest long after the guest has left, and holds that warmth quietly for whoever needs it next. Wood, his grandfather used to say, was all guest and no host. It gave you a roaring fire and a cold dawn. But stone was the patient host. Stone took the guest in slowly and gave back its warmth slowly, and never once let the house forget that there had been a fire. The old man had crossed an ocean carrying that saying in his chest, and now, 2 feet of fitted stone at a time, he was building it into the frozen ground of a valley that thought he had lost his mind. There were days when even he grew tired of it. Days when the cold was so deep and the work so slow and the laughter from the valley so constant that he would set down his tools and sit on his overturned bucket and wonder if Elspeth would have laughed at him too. But then he would remember her face in the firelight on those last terrible nights, and the wondering would stop, and he would pick up the next stone. By the time the deep snows threatened, the walls had reached their full height, and the tower began, at last, to look less like a grave marker and more like a home. He hung a single heavy door on the southern side, where the worst of the wind would never reach it. He cut one small window facing east, no bigger than 2 hands held side by side, just enough to let the morning light fall across the stone floor and tell him the night had passed. Along the inside curve of the western wall, he built a sleeping loft, raised up where the warmth would gather. And he built the firebox dead in the center of the room, low to the ground, no higher than a man's knee, lined with the best stone he had. From it, he carved shallow channels into the stone floor, spiraling outward like the arms of some great slow galaxy, so that the warm air and the smoke would travel out beneath the whole floor before they ever found the chimney on the cold northern face. And over the top of it all, he laid a roof of heavy timber beams. And over the timber, he packed a thick layer of sod and earth, so that even the roof would hold the heat, and the cold would have nowhere left to slip in. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it. A round tower of gray stone, smoke not yet rising from its chimney, sitting alone in a white field under a low and heavy sky. It was not beautiful, the way the valley measured beauty. It had no sharp, clean lines, no proud square corners, no fresh-cut timber gleaming in the sun. It was squat and gray and strange. But the old man looked at it the way a man looks at something he has poured his whole grieving heart into, and to him, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever made. The valley, of course, did not see it that way. The valley had turned the old man's tower into a kind of sport. It is a hard thing, but a true one, that people who are frightened of something they don't understand will very often laugh at it, because laughing feels safer than wondering. And by now, the whole settlement was laughing. It began with looks and head shakes. It grew into jokes. And before long, it had become the favorite entertainment of the cold gray evenings, when the work was done, and there was nothing to do but sit close to the fire and talk. They talked about the old man. They gave his tower names: a grain silo, some called it; a crypt, said others. One man swore it looked like an oven, and that come midwinter the fool would either roast himself alive or freeze solid, and either way it would be a story worth telling. And then the betting began. It started small. Amos Dunn, the homesteader who was very sure he knew everything there was to know about cold, wagered a fine smoked ham that the old man would give up and abandon the tower before the deep of winter. "He'll come crawling to one of our cabins by midwinter," Amos Dunn said, begging for a warm corner. "Mark me, a smoked ham says it." Someone took the bet at once. Then Hollis Boone, the master carpenter, not to be left out, wagered 2 full days of his own labor that the old man would burn more wood in his stone box than any cabin in the valley. "Stone draws the cold," he said again, as he said at every chance now. "He'll be feeding that firebox day and night just to keep from freezing. 2 days' work says it." And finally, Calder Foster, the trapper, leaning in a doorway with the frost still on his furs, offered up a fine beaver pelt. "I'll wager this," he said, holding it up so the firelight caught the deep brown of it, "that the inside of that fool's tower never once climbs above the chill. Not all winter. A pelt says it stays a stone icebox from the first snow to the last." The room roared its approval. A ham, a stretch of labor, and a pelt. The whole valley, it seemed, was betting against the old man, and every one of them was sure they had made an easy wager. There was one night, late in the building, when the mockery went further than mockery. A few of the younger men, full of cider and full of themselves, came out to the field in the dark. They thought it would be a fine joke to topple a length of the old man's outer wall where it was still curing and let him find it broken in the morning. They got one stone loose before the heavy southern door opened, and the old man stood there in the moonlight, a lamp in his hand, saying nothing. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He only looked at them. And there was something in that look, something quiet and steady and bottomlessly sad, that made grown men feel like boys caught stealing apples. One by one they backed away, one of them shamefaced, even bent, and set the loosened stone roughly back in its place. The old man watched them go. Then he knelt in the cold and the dark, and he reset the stone properly, the way it wanted to sit, and he packed the mortar back into the seam with his bare fingers. He did not speak of it to anyone, but the boy heard of it, the way boys hear of everything. And the next day he came to the field with his small fists clenched and his eyes hot with a child's fury on the old man's behalf. "They're cruel," the boy said. "They're stupid, and they're cruel, and I hate them." The old man went on with his work for a moment. Then he set down his trowel. "No," he said quietly. "Not cruel. Frightened." The boy stared at him. "A man laughs loudest at the thing he's most afraid might be true," the old man said. "They're not laughing at me, lad. They're laughing at the cold. Because they don't know, yet, how much of it is coming." He picked up the trowel again. "Hate's a heavy stone to carry," he added. "Set it down. You'll need your hands for better things." The boy did not fully understand, but he unclenched his fists, and he picked up a stone, and he handed it to the old man, and the two of them went back to work in the cold. The bets reached you and Hale eventually. They always do. In a small place where 40 souls live, folded together against the cold. The boy told him, in fact, his small face troubled, repeating the things he had heard the grown men say. The old man listened, and then he shrugged. "Let them," he said. "A man who has nothing to wonder about will always find something to wager on." He went back to his work, but the boy noticed, the boy who noticed everything, that the old man's hands moved a little more carefully after that, a little more deliberately, as if he were aware now that more eyes than ever were watching for him to fail. What the valley did not see was the carpenter alone in his fine cabin, brooding. Hollis Boone had taken the old man's silence personally. A man who has spent 30 years mastering a trade does not take kindly to a silent old stranger arriving out of nowhere and suggesting, without ever saying a word of it directly, that everything he knows is wrong. It gnawed at him. The old man's silence gnawed at him worst of all. If Ewan had only argued back, Hollis Boone could have argued with him. If the old man had boasted, Boone could have knocked him down a peg. But the old man just worked, quietly, patiently, letting his strange gray tower rise without a word of defense. And somehow that quiet was louder than any boast. His wife, a patient woman who had spent many years married to a proud man, watched him brood by his own fire one evening and finally said, "Hollis, let the old man be. What is it to you if he wants to freeze in a pile of rocks?" And Hollis Boone could not answer her, because he did not know what it was to him. He only knew that every time he passed that gray tower rising in the field, something twisted in his chest. A doubt, small and unwelcome, that he could not name and would not look at. So he did what proud men do with a doubt they cannot face. He resolved to crush it, loudly, in front of everyone. The reckoning came on a cold gray Sunday when the whole settlement gathered together as it did each week. It should have been a quiet gathering, a time for people to be near one another, to share what little warmth and company they had before the long cold week began again. But Hollis Boone had other plans. He stood up before the gathering, and he decided to win the argument the old man refused to have. "Friends," he said, in the voice of a man who is enjoying himself, "I think it's time somebody explained plainly why our stonemason is going to spend this winter learning a hard lesson." The room quieted, curious, glad of the entertainment. "Now, I don't say this to be cruel," Boone went on, in a tone that suggested he did not mind being a little cruel. "I say it because somebody ought to. Stone, draws, cold." He held up a thick finger. "You all know it. You felt it. Put your bare hand on a stone wall in the dead of winter. And what happens? It pulls the warmth straight out of you, right through your skin, faster than wood ever would." Heads nodded around the room. He was not entirely wrong. That was the dangerous thing about Hollis Boone. He was not a stupid man, and he was not entirely wrong. Touch cold stone, and it does pull the heat from your hand faster than wood. That much was true. But the carpenter had built his whole argument on that one true thing, and then walked it straight off a cliff, because he was talking about the feeling of a surface. and the old man was building for the whole body of the stone. Boone did not understand the difference between heat passing through a thing and heat being held inside a thing. He did not understand that 2 feet of stone is not the same animal as a thin, cold slab. He could not imagine that the very mass he mocked, the heavy, patient, foolish weight of it, was the entire secret. But he did not know that he did not understand. And so he stood there, warm and certain, and he carried the whole room along with him. He's built himself a great hollow stone, Boone said, spreading his hands wide. And come the killing cold, that stone is going to do what stone does. It's going to suck the heat out of his little fire faster than he can make it. He'll burn through his wood. Then he'll burn through more. And one cold morning, he let it hang. We'll go out to that field, and we'll find a frozen old man and a cold gray tower, and we'll all be very sorry. But we won't be surprised. The room was silent for a moment, and then someone laughed, and the spell of it broke, and the whole gathering filled with the low, warm rumble of people agreeing with one another. Amos Dunn slapped his knee. Calder Foster grinned into his furs. It was settled as far as the valley was concerned. The old man was a fool, and the carpenter had proven it. And the only thing left to do was wait for winter to write the ending everyone already knew. But not everyone was laughing. In the corner, the same as always, sat Josiah Pryor, the quiet man, the counter of things. He had not said a word through the whole performance. He had only listened, with his arms folded and his eyes half closed, the way he listened to everything. Carefully, weighing it, setting it against what he knew of the world. And something in Hollis Boone's speech did not sit right with him. It was too clean, too sure, too pleased with itself. In Josiah Pryor's long experience, the truth was almost never that tidy. The truth had rough edges. The truth made a man say, "I don't know," more often than it made him say, "I told you so." And there was something else. A few days before, Josiah Pryor had walked out to the old man's field, not to mock, just to look. He had stood at the edge of the clearing, and the old man had glanced up from his work and nodded to him, and gone back to it without a word. Josiah had watched him for the better part of an hour, and he had seen the woodpile, not the great towering cords that every cabin in the valley was stacking against the cold. A small pile, a modest little stack of split pine, kept dry under a bit of canvas. Far too little, by any measure, the valley would have used. And yet, the old man did not seem worried about it at all. A man who believed his tower would devour wood the way Hollis Boone claimed would have stacked it to the sky. This one had not. Before Josiah left that day, he had asked the old man a single question. "That all the wood you mean to lay in?" And the old man had looked at the little pile and then back at Josiah and said only, "It's enough." Not boastful, not anxious, just certain. Either the old stonemason was the greatest fool in the valley, or he knew something that the carpenter, for all his certainty, did not. Josiah Pryor did not know which, but he was a patient man, and a fair one, and he made up his mind, sitting there in the corner while the room laughed, that he would not decide until the cold itself had spoken. He would watch. He would measure. He would keep his judgment until the truth, whatever it was, had earned it. That, he thought, was the only honest thing a man could do. The boy kept coming. Through all of it, The jokes, the bets, the carpenter's cruel certainty. The boy kept walking out to the field in the gray afternoons, and somewhere along the way, without either of them ever quite deciding it, Silas Voss became, in every way that mattered, the old man's apprentice. The old man never thanked him with many words. That was not his way. But he began to leave the easy stones near the boy's reach. He began to slow his pace, just slightly, so the child could keep up. He began, in 100 small, unspoken ways, to make room for him. He was stern with the boy when sternness was needed. "Not that one," he would say, when the boy reached for a stone with a hidden crack. A wall is only as strong as its weakest stone. Learn to see the flaw before you build the flaw into the wall. The boy learned to see the flaw. He was gentle with the boy when gentleness was needed. On the coldest afternoons, when the child's lips had gone blue and his teeth had begun to chatter, the old man would stop everything, no matter how the light was failing, and build up the small fire, and set the boy down beside it, and press one of the warm river stones into his frozen little hands. "Warm through first," he would say. "The wall will still be here tomorrow. You only get the one of you." And the boy would sit and warm his hands, and watch the old man's gray face in the firelight, and feel something he had not felt since his own father went into the ground. Safe. He felt safe. The old man, for his part, would never have said such a thing aloud. But there were moments, watching the boy bent seriously over a stone, his small tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in concentration, when something would catch in the old man's chest. A memory. A grief. The ghost of a child he had once hoped to have, in another life, in another country, before the long winter took the woman who would have been that child's mother. He had never had a son. He had never had a child at all. He and Elspeth had hoped in the early years. They had waited and hoped, and the child had never come. And after a time, they had stopped speaking of it, because some sorrows are easier carried in silence. And then she was gone, and the hope was gone with her, and he had made his peace, long ago, with the cold fact that he would never have a son to teach. But here, in this strange far valley, with his strange gray tower rising behind him, and the whole world laughing at his back, a small serious boy had walked out across a frozen field and decided, all on his own, to stand beside him. The old man did not have words for what that meant, but on the nights when the work was done and the boy had run home through the dark, the tower felt a little less empty, and the grief he carried felt a little less heavy. That was something he had not expected to find when he crossed the sea. That was something he had not even dared to hope for. The boy's mother began to watch too. Maren Voss had not meant to. A widow with a young son and a hard life had little time for watching strange old men build foolish towers in the cold. She had 100 things to do before the snow closed in, and not nearly enough hours to do them. But she watched anyway. She watched the way the old man treated her boy. She had been afraid at first. A mother is always afraid. A strange man, a lonely field, a child drawn to it like a moth to a lamp. Of course she was afraid. So she had gone out one evening, sharp-tongued and ready, to bring her son home and to tell the old man to leave him be. and she had stopped at the edge of the field because what she saw there was not what she had feared. She saw the old man stop his work in the failing light, with the cold coming down hard, to wrap her shivering son's hands around a warm stone. She saw him crouch down to the boy's level. She saw him listen with the whole of his attention to whatever small thing the child was telling him. She saw a lonely old man being kind to a fatherless boy for no reason at all except that kindness was in him, and the sharp words died in her throat. She walked out across the field. The old man rose when he saw her coming and stood and waited in that quiet, patient way of his. "He shouldn't trouble you," she said. "He'll be underfoot. I'll keep him home." The old man looked at her. Then he looked at the boy, who had gone very still, afraid he was about to lose the one good thing in his small, cold life. "He's no trouble," the old man said. A pause. A boy should have somewhere to be, and a thing to do with his hands. That was all. But Marin Voss heard everything that was underneath it. She heard a man who knew what it was to be alone. She heard a man who knew what it was to have empty hands and an empty house and nowhere in the world that needed him. She nodded slowly, and she let her son stay. After that, she would sometimes send the boy out with something warm wrapped in a cloth, a bit of bread, a few hot potatoes, small things, the only kind of thanks a poor widow had to give. The old man always took them with a grave courtesy that made the gifts feel like more than they were. And one evening, when the cold had driven her out to fetch the boy home herself, she lingered a moment at the edge of the firelight, watching the two of them work. "They say cruel things about you," she said quietly. "In the settlement. Do you know that?" The old man did not look up from his stone. "I know," he said. "And it doesn't trouble you?" He was quiet a moment. "I buried the thing that troubles me a long time ago," he said, "on the other side of the sea. After that, a few hard words are a small cold. I have known colder." Marin Voss looked at him for a long moment, and she understood then what she had recognized in him from the very first day. The same quiet she carried herself. The quiet of a person who has loved and lost and learned to go on carrying the weight of it without complaint. "Yes," she said softly, "I expect you have." And the valley, watching from a distance, made its jokes about that too, about the widow and the foreign old fool and the fatherless boy, the three loneliest people in the valley, drawn together out at the cold edge of everything. But the old man did not hear them. He had stopped somewhere along the way, hearing the valley at all. There was one last thing the old man did, as the deep cold gathered. A strange thing, a thing that even the boy, who had grown used to his strangeness, could not make sense of. He began to gather stones from the stream, not the heavy building stones from the northern ridge. He had finished with those. The walls were up, the roof was on, the tower was all but done. These were different, smooth, round river stones, about the size of a loaf of bread, each one. He chose them with enormous care, wading out into the freezing water to feel them with his bare hands, testing their weight, turning them over, keeping some and tossing others back. He chose only the densest, the heaviest for their size, the dark, smooth ones that felt even cold, as if they were just waiting for a reason to be warm. and he carried them, one by one, back to the tower, and stacked them in a careful ring around the central firebox. The boy watched him do it for 2 whole days before he could stand the mystery no longer. "What are those for?" he finally asked. The old man set the last stone in its place and straightened, and pressed a hand to his aching back. He looked at the ring of smooth, dark stones circling the cold firebox, and a small, secret smile touched the corner of his mouth. "An old trick," he said, "from the old country. But what does it do?" The old man only shook his head. "You'll understand," he said quietly, "by midwinter." And he would say no more about it than that. The boy went home that night, burning with curiosity. He told his mother about the strange ring of stones around the cold fire. He asked her what an old trick from the old country might be. She didn't know, but she looked out the small window of her cabin, across the white and freezing dark, to where the squat gray tower sat alone under the rising moon. And she thought about the old man inside it, alone, patient, waiting, while the whole valley laughed and stacked its great cords of wood and placed its easy little bets. That strange old man sat alone in his ring of river stones, in a house that did not yet have a fire burning in its heart. And he waited for a winter he seemed to be the only soul alive who truly feared. The snow fell harder that night. The wind came down off the high country with a new and harder edge, a long, low moan that found the corners of every cabin in the valley and rattled at every door. The people pulled their blankets close and fed their stoves and told themselves they were ready. They had wood. They had walls. They had always been ready before. But out in the field, behind the heavy southern door of a squat gray tower, the old man lay awake on his sleeping loft and listened to the wind. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, across the sea, on the night the cold came for everything he loved. He lay in the dark and listened to it gather, and he was not afraid, not for himself. He laid his bare hand against the cold inner wall of the tower beside him, the wall he had built from his own grief and his grandfather's wisdom, stone upon patient stone. "Soon," he whispered, "soon they'll see. Not what an old fool built, but what an old fire remembers." Outside, the wind rose to a long howl, and the snow came down across the valley like a curtain falling at the end of an act. The easy season was over. The laughing was nearly done. And out beyond the white and frozen dark, the real cold, the killing cold, the cold the old man had crossed an entire ocean to defeat, was finally, quietly, on its way down from the mountains. There is a kind of doubt that only comes in the deep of the night. It does not visit a man while he works. It does not come while the sun is up and his hands are busy and the world is full of things to do. It waits. It waits until the work is done and the light is gone, and a man is alone with nothing between himself and his own thoughts. That was the night it came for the old stonemason. He lay on his sleeping loft in the dark, beneath the heavy sod roof he had built with his own hands, and he listened to the wind. It had changed. The soft moaning of the early storms was gone. What came down off the mountains now was something older and crueler, a long, low, endless howl that did not rise and fall like ordinary wind, but simply held, hour after hour, like a held breath that would not be let go. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before. On the other side of the sea, in another house, on the night the cold came for everything he had ever loved, and lying there in the dark, listening to it gather, the old man felt the doubt slide into the room and settle on his chest like a great cold stone. What if he was wrong? The thought came quietly, reasonably, the way the worst thoughts always do. What if the carpenter was right? What if stone really did draw the cold? What if the whole valley, all 40 of them, laughing and certain, had seen something true that he, in his grief and his stubbornness, had refused to see? He had built this tower out of a wound. He had built it because he could not bear the memory of a wooden house that failed, and a woman growing colder beside him in the dark, and a morning that came too late. But what if grief had blinded him? What if he had crossed an ocean and a country, and spent his last strength, and stood silent before a roomful of laughing men, only to build himself the very same kind of cold tomb he had spent his whole life trying to escape? And what of the boy? That thought was the coldest of all. The boy trusted him now. The boy believed in the tower the way only a child can believe. If the old man was wrong, if this was all a grieving fool's mistake, then he had taught that trusting child to believe in a thing that would betray him. He had told the boy, "It will keep your mama warm." What if it couldn't? The old man lay very still in the dark, and for the first time since he had set the first stone in the frozen ground, he was afraid. He could not lie there with it. A man can lie awake with many things, but a man like the old stonemason cannot lie awake with doubt. Doubt, for him, was a thing that had to be answered with his hands. So he rose in the dark. He lit a small lamp, and he wrapped himself against the cold, and he climbed down from the loft to walk the inside of his tower in the flickering light, the way a worried father walks the floor with a sleeping child. He ran his hand along the inner wall, stone after stone, joint after joint, reading the wall with his fingers the way another man might read a letter. And then his hand stopped. There, low on the northern wall, where the cold pressed hardest, a crack. It was small, barely the width of a knife blade, a hairline thing where the mortar had pulled away as the deep cold drove into the stone. But the old man knew, the way only a man who has built with stone for a lifetime can know, exactly what that small crack meant. A crack lets the cold in, a crack lets the warmth out, and a small crack on the coldest night of the cruelest winter, in the one wall that faced the killing wind, was not a small thing at all. It was the whole question. It was wood all over again. The seam, the gap, the small unsealed place where the warmth slips away and the cold comes in, and a man feeds the fire all night and watches it never be enough. The old man stood there in the lamplight, his hand pressed flat against the crack, and the doubt rose up in him like cold water. And then he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went to work. He mixed his mortar by hand in the freezing dark, lime and clay and water, working it with his bare fingers because gloves could not feel what fingers could feel. The cold bit into his hands until they ached, and then it bit deeper until they burned, and then deeper still until they went a frightening kind of numb. He did not stop. He pressed the mortar into the crack with his ruined fingers. He worked it deep. He smoothed it. He felt for the next flaw, and the next, sealing every small place the cold had tried to open, all through the longest hours of that long, howling night. He was no longer a master mason, sure and steady. He was an old man on his knees in the cold and the dark, fighting a single thin crack as if his very life depended on it, and in a way that no one in the valley would ever fully understand. It did, because he was not only sealing a wall, he was sealing the wound. He was answering the doubt. He was fighting, with his frozen and bleeding hands, the same battle he had lost once before in another house across the sea. Only this time, he swore in the dark. This time the cold would not win. This time the warmth would hold. When the small east window finally turned gray with the first weak light of morning, the old man sat back on his heels, his hands ruined and trembling, and he looked at the wall. The crack was gone. Every seam was sealed. The tower was whole. And outside that whole gray wall, the real cold had finally come. It came down off the mountains like a living thing. It was not the cold of an ordinary winter. It was something far beyond that. A cold so deep and so total that it seemed to press against the world with a weight you could almost feel through the walls. The snow did not fall so much as it was driven, sideways, in great ghostly sheets that erased the whole valley from view. The wind howled without pause, and the cold sank, and kept on sinking, down past anything the people of the valley had ever known, down into a place where the very air seemed to turn to glass. It was the kind of cold that does not just chill a man. It is the kind of cold that hunts. And all across the valley, it began, room by room, house by house, to find its way in. In the cabin of Amos Dunn, the homesteader who had wagered a smoked ham, the morning came with ice on the inside of the walls, not frost. Ice. The breath of his sleeping family had frozen against the timber overnight, and now the inside of his proud log home glittered with the thin gray skin of it, no matter how high he built the fire. His iron stove roared. His eldest son had fed it through the whole night, and his arms ached from the chopping, and still the warmth reached only a few feet into the room before the cold swallowed it whole. His wife wrapped the little ones in every hide and blanket they owned, and held them against the warm metal sides of the stove, and watched her breath turn to mist in the air of her own home. By the morning, they had burned through a great heap of wood, and they were no warmer for it. The cabin of Hollis Boone, the carpenter, fared a little better. His joints were tighter. His chinking was finer. He was, whatever else could be said of him, a master of his trade, and his walls held the cold out a little longer than most, but only a little. Even he, the proud carpenter, the man who had stood up before the whole valley to explain why stone draws cold, even he could not keep the warmth in his home. He fed his fire, and his hands ached, and his wife pulled her shawl tighter and said nothing. And his children slept in their coats, huddled together for the warmth their own house could not give them. And in the long, freezing hours of that terrible cold, Hollis Boone did something he had not done in a very long while. He doubted himself, just a little. He looked at his roaring, hungry fire, and his shrinking woodpile, and the ice creeping up his walls. And somewhere in the back of his certain mind, a small voice whispered a question he did not want to hear. What if the old man was not the fool? He pushed it away, but it did not go far. All across the valley, it was the same story. 40 souls behind 40 doors, feeding their fires like starving animals and watching the cold win anyway. Families that had laughed at the old man 2 months before, now too cold to laugh at anything. Old Josiah Pryor sat in his own cold cabin through that first terrible night, his blankets wrapped around his shoulders, and he thought about a small stack of split pine under a bit of canvas, and a quiet old man who had said only, "It's enough." And he wondered, out across the white and frozen valley, the trapper Calder Foster was the only soul fool enough, or hard enough, to be moving in that cold. He had lines to check, and a beaver pelt riding on a wager, and a stubborn streak as wide as the valley itself. So he wrapped himself in fur until he looked more bear than man, and he pushed his horse out into the white. His path took him past the old stonemason's field, and there, half blind in the driving snow, he saw something that stopped him cold. The tower stood, gray and squat and patient, just as it always had. But the smoke rising from its chimney, was wrong. By every law that Calder Foster knew, that chimney should have been pouring smoke. On a morning this cruel, any man trying to stay alive would be feeding his fire like a furnace, sending up a great black plume into the storm. Instead, there was only a thin, lazy wisp, a pale ribbon of smoke drifting up almost gently into the howling sky, as if the fire beneath it were nothing more than the small, cheerful blaze of an autumn evening. It made no sense. Either the old man had let his fire die, which, in this cold, meant he was already dead, or something was happening inside that gray tower that Calder Foster could not begin to explain. He climbed down from his horse. He pushed through the drifts to the foot of the wall, and, hardly knowing why he did it, he pulled off one heavy fur glove and pressed his bare hand flat against the cold stone of the tower. He went very still. The stone was warm, not the searing heat of a fire on the other side of a thin wall. Not hot at all, but warm. A deep, steady, gentle warmth, rising up out of the stone itself, out of the very wall, in the middle of a cold so deep it could freeze the breath in a man's chest. Calder Foster stood there with his bare hand against the impossible warmth, and the wind tore at him, and he could not make the world make sense. Then he stumbled to the heavy southern door, and he pounded on it with his frozen fist. The door swung open almost at once, and the trapper stood there, frost in his beard, snow caked to his furs, and stared. Because Ewan Hale stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no blankets, no furs. Just a wool shirt, open at the throat, and a face that was not blue with cold, but faintly, healthily flushed, like a man who has been sitting comfortably by a hearth on a pleasant evening. Behind him, the inside of the tower glowed with a soft, even warmth, and in the center of the room, the fire that should have been roaring for its life, was small, almost lazy. A few quiet logs, ringed by those strange, smooth river stones the old man had gathered. And the stones glowed, a deep, dull, ember red, like coals that had drunk in the heat of 100 fires, and were giving it back, slow and steady, into the room. The old man looked at the trapper standing frozen and astonished in his doorway, and he said, with the faintest ghost of a smile, "Cold enough for you?" The trapper opened his mouth, but the words would not come. "Come in," the old man said gently. "Get warm. There's tea." And Calder Foster stepped across the threshold, out of the killing cold, and into the warm. And the heavy door swung shut behind him. The warmth wrapped around him like something living. It did not blast at him the way a roaring stove would. It came from everywhere at once. From the floor, from the walls, from the very air. A deep, soft, pervasive warmth that he felt in his bones before he felt it on his skin. He pulled off his other glove with shaking fingers and laid his hand against the inner wall. Warm, not hot. Warm, like a stone that has lain in the summer sun. "How much wood?" he managed at last, his voice barely a whisper. "How much wood are you burning?" The old man shrugged. "A few pieces," he said. 3, maybe 4, every few hours. I built the fire up at first light. Added a log or two since." He nodded toward the small, modest stack of split pine by the door. "That's all I've used since yesterday." Calder Foster stared at the little pile of wood. He thought of his own cabin. He thought of Amos Dunn's, with the ice on the walls. He thought of every house in the valley, all of them feeding their fires like starving animals through the longest night any of them had ever known. And here sat one old man in his shirt sleeves, warm as a spring morning, on a handful of split pine and a ring of glowing stones. The trapper sank slowly onto a low bench by the fire, and he understood, all at once, that he had been wrong, that the carpenter had been wrong, that the whole Laughing Valley had been wrong. "I have to tell them," he said hoarsely. "I have to tell the others." The old man poured the tea. "Tell them," he said quietly. A pause. "But tell them the truth. This isn't magic, Calder Foster. It's only stone." He handed the trapper a warm cup. Stone. And a man who remembered what stone can do. Word travels fast, even through a storm, when the word is impossible enough. By the time the worst of the cold had loosened its grip just enough to let people move, a small huddled crowd had gathered outside the gray tower, breath clouding, faces wrapped against the wind, drawn out into the cruel air by a thing they could not believe until they had seen it. And at the front of them stood Josiah Pryor, the quiet man, the counter of things. He had come with his thermometer, and he had come with his notebook, because Josiah Pryor was not a man to believe a wonder until he had measured it, and he was not a man to dismiss one either until he had given it the same fair chance. The old man let him in, and Josiah Pryor stepped from the bitter cold into the warm, and for a moment the quiet man simply stood there, his careful eyes moving slowly around the room, the low fire in its center, the ring of glowing stones, the faint spiral grooves in the floor, carrying the warmth outward, the thick, patient walls, breathing their gentle heat into the room. He raised his thermometer and he waited for it to settle, and when it had, he read it once. And then, because he did not trust a wonder, he read it again. And then Josiah Pryor, who had spent a lifetime keeping his judgments to himself, said one quiet word. Remarkable. He stepped back outside into the gathered crowd, and he held the thermometer up for them to see the reading he had taken in the bitter air. The difference between the two numbers, the cold one out here and the warm one in there, was a thing none of them had words for. It was the difference between a tomb and a home. "And the wood," someone called out. It was Amos Dunn, his face raw with cold, his voice thin. "How much wood is he burning to do it?" The old man pointed to the small pile by his door. "That," he said simply, "since yesterday." A murmur ran through the crowd. Amos Dunn stared at the little stack of pine. He thought of the great heap he had fed into his stove through the night, and the ice that still glittered on his walls, and his children sleeping in their coats. "I burned 10 times that," he said quietly, "and my cabin won't hold 40. His wife stood beside him, the youngest child wrapped against her, and she said, in a small voice that carried in the cold, "The water pail froze solid in the night, right beside the stove." No one laughed now. There was no laughter left in any of them. They stood in the killing cold and looked at the warm gray tower, and one by one, the certainty they had carried so easily through the autumn drained out of them and left only wonder and shame and the slow dawning understanding that the fool they had laughed at had been the only wise man among them. But Josiah Pryor was not finished. He was a fair man, and a thorough one, and he wanted the whole truth, not just the warm and easy part of it. So he asked the old man for one more thing. "Let the fire die," he said. The crowd stirred. "Let it go out entirely," Josiah Pryor went on, "and let me sit, and let me watch, and let me measure how long this stone of yours can hold its warmth with no fire at all." The old man considered this, and then he nodded. "Aye," he said. "That's the right question to ask." So he laid one last log on the fire, and he let it burn down. And as the evening drew on, and the crowd thinned, and the cold pressed harder against the walls, the small fire sank to embers, and then to ash, and then to nothing at all. And Josiah Pryor sat through the long, dark hours, his thermometer in his hand, and his notebook open on his knee. And he watched. And what he watched, he could scarcely believe. The fire was dead. There was no flame, no coal, no source of heat at all save the great patient mass of warmed stone all around them, and that ring of dark river stones, still glowing faintly in the dark. And hour after hour, the tower held its warmth. It did not plunge into cold the way a wooden house does the moment its fire dies. It cooled, yes, but slowly, gently, so slow it could hardly be felt, the great warm mass of stone giving back, all through the night, the heat it had so patiently drunk in. Hour after hour after hour, that dead-fired tower stayed warm, long past the time when any cabin in the valley would have turned to ice. And as the gray light finally crept back through the small east window, Josiah Pryor closed his notebook, and he sat for a long moment in the quiet warmth, and he understood that he had measured something that would change the valley forever. He looked at the old man. "It seems," he said slowly, "that everything we were so sure of was wrong." The old man said nothing. He only laid his hand against the warm stone wall, as he always did, and let the quiet of being right at last settle over him like a blanket. But the winter was not finished with the valley. Josiah Pryor's long night of measuring had been done in a lull, a brief, deceptive calm, the kind that comes when the worst of the cold draws back, as if only to gather its strength. For a day, the wind eased. The sun even showed its pale face for an hour, weak and far away. and the people of the valley let themselves believe the worst was behind them. It was not. A few nights later, it returned, and this time it came worse than before, deeper, hungrier, more patient. The wind rose higher than it had risen all winter, and the cold sank lower than it had ever sunk, and the dark came down so total that a man could not see his own hand at the end of his own arm. And out in a small cabin at the cold edge of the valley, a widow's fire was dying. Maren Voss had done everything right. She had stacked her wood. She had chinked her walls. She had held her small home together with the fierce, exhausted care of a woman alone with a child in a hard world. But her cabin was poorly placed, set low where the cold pooled, and her woodpile was small. And on the worst night of the worst winter the valley had ever known, it was not enough. Her fire sank. The cold crept in, and the widow, wrapping her son in every blanket they owned, felt the same terrible helplessness that the old man had felt once, long ago, in another house across the sea. The warmth was leaving, and she could not hold it. She had felt this before, in a smaller way, the winter her husband died. The terrible knowledge that the cold was bigger than she was, that all her work, all her care, all her love might not be enough to keep her child from harm. She pulled Silas close, and she pressed her lips to his hair, and she felt herself growing heavy and slow in the way the deep cold makes a person heavy and slow. It was the boy who saved them both. Silas Voss, 8 years old and brave the way only a frightened child can be brave, looked at his mother's gray face and his dying fire, and he thought of the warm gray tower across the field, and the old man who had pressed warm stones into his frozen hands, and told him, "You only get the one of you." And he made a decision no child should ever have to make. He wrapped himself in his thin coat, and he slipped out into the killing storm, and he fought his way across the frozen dark toward the only warmth he knew. The old man heard the knock. It was so faint against the howl of the wind that he almost missed it. A small, weak, desperate knocking, low on the heavy southern door. He opened it, and there, half frozen, white with snow, swaying on his feet, stood the boy. "My mama," Silas whispered, through lips gone blue. The fire's almost out. She won't wake right." For one terrible heartbeat, the old man did not move, because he had stood in a doorway like this before. He had felt this cold before. He had watched a fire die before. He had reached out once in another life to save someone he loved from the cold. And he had been too late, and the old grief rose up in him like a wave. But this time he was not too late. This time he had built a tower that could hold the fire. The old man moved. He swept the boy up and set him by the glowing stones. He pulled on his coat. And then this man of 52 years, with his ruined hands and his aching back and his heart full of an old grief, pushed out into the killing storm. The cold hit him like a wall. The wind tried to take the breath from his lungs. The snow stung his face like flung sand. The dark was so complete that he could see nothing at all, and he made his way across that frozen field by memory alone, by the count of his own steps, by the stubborn certainty of a man who had paced that ground 1,000 times. He found the dark cabin. He found the widow, slumped and gray beside her dead fire, the warmth nearly gone from the room and nearly gone from her. And he gathered her up in his arms. She was cold, so cold, just as cold as another woman had been on another night in a house that could not hold the warmth. For one moment, the years fell away, and he was back across the sea, kneeling beside Elspeth in the ashes of a dead fire. Too late, always too late. But the old man set his jaw against the memory. Not this time. And he carried her out into the storm, step by stubborn step, his old legs screaming, the cold clawing at them both, back across the white and frozen dark, toward the squat gray tower that glowed, faint and patient and unbreakable, like a single warm heart beating in the heart of the cold. He carried her through the door. He laid her down beside the glowing stones, beside her son, in the deep and steady warmth that no storm could reach. And he knelt there, his ruined hands trembling, and he watched. He watched the color come back into her face. He watched her breathing ease. He watched her eyes flutter and open and find her son safe and warm beside her, and then find the old man kneeling over them both, snow still melting in his gray hair. "You're safe," he said, in a voice rougher than stone. "You're warm. The cold can't reach you here." And the widow began quietly to weep, not from fear, from the overwhelming, unbearable relief of being warm, of being safe, of being held with her child, in the heart of a thing built by a man the whole valley had called a fool. The old man stayed kneeling beside them as the storm screamed itself out against the patient stone, and for the first time since he had crossed the sea, since he had knelt on a cold floor beside a fire that failed, the old grief in his chest loosened its grip. He had not been able to save the one he lost, but he had built something with his own grieving hands, something the whole world had laughed at. And tonight, in the deep of the cruelest cold, it had reached out and caught a mother and her child as they fell. The stone had held the fire, and the fire had held them all. Morning came soft and gray through the small east window. The storm had finally spent itself in the night. The terrible wind had quieted at last, worn down to a low and weary whisper, and the world outside lay buried and silent under a blanket of white. But inside the gray tower, it was warm. The widow woke slowly, the way a person wakes from a deep and dreamless rest. For a moment, she did not know where she was. She only knew that she was warm. Warm all the way through. In a way she had not been in longer than she could remember. She opened her eyes. Her son lay sleeping beside her, his cheeks pink, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of a child who feels safe. And across the room, in the low golden light of a small and patient fire, sat the old man. He had not slept. He sat with his back against the warm stone wall, his ruined hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, watching over the two of them the way a shepherd watches over a flock through a hard night. When he saw that she was awake, he said nothing. He only nodded once slowly, as if to say, "You're safe now. You can rest." And the widow, looking at this strange, silent old man who had carried her out of the killing cold, felt something break open and heal over in her chest, both at once. She did not have words for it, so she simply nodded back, and the two of them sat there in the warm quiet, with the sleeping boy between them, while the gray light grew slowly brighter, and the long, cruel winter finally began, at last, to loosen its grip on the world. The knock came later that morning. It was a heavy, hesitant knock. The knock of a man who is not sure he has the right to be standing where he is standing. The old man opened the door, and there stood Hollis Boone. The carpenter looked smaller than he had in the gathering, that gray Sunday when he had stood up before the whole valley to explain why the old man was a fool. The certainty had gone out of him. The pride had gone out of his shoulders. He stood in the snow with his hat in his hands, and he could not quite meet the old man's eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the snow between them, and then Hollis Boone, the master carpenter, the proudest man in the valley, said the hardest words a proud man can ever say. "I was wrong." The old man did not answer. He only waited. "I stood up in front of everyone," Boone went on, his voice rough, "and I told them you'd freeze. I made them laugh at you. I was so sure." He trailed off. He looked down at the hat turning in his hands. "My family slept in their coats last night," he said quietly. "My children, in their coats, in a house I built with my own 2 hands, and I couldn't keep them warm." He lifted his eyes at last. "And you carried that woman and her boy out of a storm that would have killed any of us, into a house everyone said was a tomb. And they're alive. They're warm." He swallowed hard. "I don't understand it," Hollis Boone said. "I've built houses for 30 years, and I don't understand the first thing about how you did this." A pause. "Will you teach me?" "Now." There are men who, in that moment, would have smiled a hard smile. There are men who would have said, "I told you so." There are men who, having been laughed at by the whole valley, would have taken that moment to savor it, to make the proud man stand a little longer in the cold, to take back, all at once, every cruel word that had been spoken. The old stonemason was not one of those men. He looked at Hollis Boone standing there with his hat in his hands and his pride in pieces at his feet, and he saw not a man who had wronged him. He saw a father who had been frightened in the night, a craftsman who had given his whole life to a trade, and was honest enough, in the end, to admit it had failed him. A proud man, brave enough to knock on the door of the man he had mocked. The old man stepped back from the doorway, and he held the door open wide. "Come in, Hollis Boone," he said. His voice was gentle. "It's cold out there. Come in by the fire, and we'll start at the beginning." And the carpenter came in out of the cold, and the door closed behind him, and not one word of "I told you so" was ever spoken. That was the thing about the old man that the valley would talk about for years to come. Not the tower, not the warmth, the way he taught. He could have hoarded what he knew. He could have made himself the most important man in the valley, the one with the secret, the one everyone needed. He could have traded his knowledge for goods, for labor, for the respect that had been denied him for so long. He did none of that. He gave it away, all of it, freely, to anyone who came and asked. By the time the snows began to soften, the gray tower had become the most visited place in the whole settlement. Not for mockery now, but for learning. The same people who had laughed at him now sat on his benches with their hats in their hands and asked him their careful questions and wrote down his careful answers. How thick must the walls be? What kind of stone holds the warmth best? Where must the firebox sit? And the old man answered every question, patiently, the way his grandfather had once answered his. He would take a man's rough hand and lay it against the warm stone, the way he had once laid the boy's hand around a river stone, and he would say, "Feel that. That is not magic. That is only patience made solid." He held no grudges. He kept no accounts of who had laughed loudest. When Amos Dunn came to his door, shamefaced, the old man greeted him the same as he greeted everyone, and sat him down by the fire, and taught him. But there was one thing he made very sure they understood. "This is not mine," he told them more than once. "I didn't invent it. I'm no clever man." He would lay his hand on the warm stone wall. "People built this way long before me, in the old country and in older countries than that. People who buried enough of their own in the cold to learn how to keep the living warm." He would look around at the faces watching him. "I only carried it here," he said. "I only remembered it when everyone else had forgotten." That was the heart of it for him. He had not been smarter than the valley. He had only refused to throw away something old and hard-won simply because it was old. He had only listened to the dead and trusted the wisdom of people long gone when the whole living world told him they were fools. And the cold, in the end, had proven the dead right. The valley changed after that winter, slowly, the way real things change. And the old man's wisdom did not stay locked inside his tower. It walked out the door in the hands of every person who had once laughed at him, and each of them carried it somewhere different. Hollis Boone was the first. The carpenter could not bring himself to tear down the house he had spent his life perfecting. But he was a practical man, and practical men follow results. So he built a great stone hearth into the corner of his cabin, deep and wide, ringed with smooth river stones, set right where his iron stove had always stood. And when the next cold came, his stove warmed the stone through the long evening, and the stone gave back its warmth through the long night. And for the first time in all his years in that valley, Hollis Boone's children slept warm, without waking, without their coats. His woodpile, that next winter, lasted nearly twice as long. He never forgot who had taught him that, and he never again, as long as he lived, laughed at a man for knowing something he himself did not. Amos Dunn could not do the same. His cabin sat too low, in a cold pocket of the land, and no amount of stone would fix a foundation built in the wrong place. But the old man found another way to help him. He showed Amos Dunn how to use the stone in reverse, how to bury great warm stones in his root cellar so they would hold back the worst of the cold and keep his stored food from freezing through the dark of winter. And Amos Dunn, who had wagered a smoked ham that the old man would fail, brought that very ham to the tower one evening and set it down, and did not say much, because he was not a man of many words. But the old man understood. Some debts are not paid with the thing that was wagered. They are paid with the bringing of it. Even Calder Foster, the trapper, who was rarely home, and could not have built a stone tower if his life depended on it, even he carried a piece of the old man's wisdom out onto his long, cold trap lines. He learned to gather smooth stones by day, and warm them in his evening fire, and wrap them in leather, and lay them in his bedroll at night. They held their warmth for hours, and on the coldest nights, far from any home, Calder Foster slept warm beneath the stars, all because a strange old man had once pressed a warm stone into a frightened boy's hands and said, "It remembers." But the deepest change, the one that mattered most, was not made of stone at all. The old man had crossed an ocean alone. He had built his tower alone. He had stood before the laughing valley alone. He had lain awake in the dark with his doubt, alone, on the worst night of the winter. He had been alone for so long that he had stopped believing he could be anything else, and then, slowly, so slowly that he hardly noticed it happening, he stopped being alone. It began with the boy. Silas Voss could not be kept away from the tower now if you'd chained him. He came every day, the moment his chores were done, and he learned at the old man's side the way the old man had once learned at his grandfather's. He learned to read a stone with his hands. He learned to see the hidden flaw before it became a weakness in the wall. He learned to mix the mortar and to set the firebox, and to choose the dense, dark stones that drank the warmth and gave it back. But more than that, he learned the things that have no name, the patience, the care, the quiet certainty of a man who knows that the slow, honest thing, done well, will outlast the fast, easy thing every single time. And the old man, teaching him, felt the great hollow place in his chest, the place where a son might have been, in another life, begin at last to fill. The widow came too. She came at first to fetch her boy, and then she came to bring the old man bread, and then she came simply because the warmest, kindest place in the whole valley was a round gray tower at the edge of a field, and the warmest, kindest thing in it was a silent old man with ruined hands. She would sit by the fire while the boy worked. She would mend by its light, and sometimes, in the quiet, she and the old man would talk, in the slow, halting, careful way of two people who have both lost too much to give their hearts away easily. She told him one evening about her husband, about the fever that took him, and the long first winter alone, and the fear that had lived in her chest ever since, the fear of not being enough to keep her child safe in a hard world. And the old man, who had never told a living soul, told her about Elspeth, about her laugh that could warm a room, about the way she used to tease him for his silences, about the wooden house he had built in too much of a hurry because they were young and could not wait, about the fire that was never enough, and the wind that would not stop, and the morning that came too late, about why a man would cross an ocean to learn how to keep the warmth from leaving. The widow listened, and when he was done, she did not offer him pity, which he could not have borne. She only reached across the quiet space between them and laid her hand over his ruined hand and held it. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Outside, the snow fell soft and gentle, and inside, the stone held the fire, and two people who had each been frozen for a very long time sat together in the warmth and slowly, quietly, began to thaw. The seasons turned, the way seasons do, and somewhere in the turning of them, without anyone ever quite deciding it, the round gray tower stopped being the home of a lonely old man and became simply home. The widow and her boy did not have to be asked. One day they were visitors, and the next they were not. And no one could have told you exactly when the change had happened, because it had happened the way the best changes happen, so naturally that it seemed it had always been so. There was no grand wedding. That was not their way, either of them. There was only a quiet understanding, witnessed by a few, that this woman and this man, who had both been so alone for so long, would be alone no longer. The old man, who had eaten alone for more years than he cared to count, no longer ate alone. There was a child's laughter in the tower now. There was a woman's voice and the smell of bread and small muddy boots by the heavy southern door, and the 1,000 small warm sounds of a life being lived in company instead of in silence. He had built the tower to hold the fire. He had never dreamed it would hold a family, but that, in the end, was the thing it held best of all. On the long winter evenings, the three of them would sit by the glowing stones, and the old man would tell the boy stories of the old country, of his grandfather, and the thick-walled cottages, and the saying about the guest and the host. And the boy would listen, wide-eyed, and the woman would mend by the firelight, and the wind would scream outside against walls it could never get through. And the old man would look at the two of them in the warm light, and he would think of Elspeth, and he would feel not the old sharp grief, but something gentler, a kind of gratitude, as if somehow, across all that distance and all those years, she would have been glad to see him warm at last, glad to see him not alone. And the old man, who had come across the sea with nothing but his tools and his grief, grew old in that warm round room, surrounded by the two people the cold had tried to take, and had not. He was not a young man when he came to the valley. He grew older there. Gray turned to white. The ruined hands grew slower. The strong shoulders that had carried 1,000 stones grew stooped. But he was warm, and he was not alone. And for a man who had once knelt on a cold floor beside a fire that failed, certain he would spend the rest of his days carrying that cold inside him forever. That was a kind of healing he had never thought to ask for. The boy grew tall. He grew into a young man, and then a man, with the old man's patience in his hands, and the old man's quiet wisdom in his eyes. He learned everything the old man had to teach, and he kept it. Not the way you keep a secret, but the way you keep a promise. He built towers of his own in time, round ones with thick walls and a fire at the heart for families that needed them. And every one he built the way the old man had taught him, slowly, carefully, finding the true face of each stone and letting it. People came from beyond the valley in those years to learn the old man's way. Travelers carried word of it up and down the country. And wherever a family was warm through a hard winter on a fraction of the wood their neighbors burned, there in some quiet way was a piece of a grieving old stonemason's gift, passed on and on from hand to hand. And in time, as all things must, the old man came at last to the end of his long road. He went gently, in the warm round tower he had built with his own grieving hands, on a soft evening with the fire burning low and the stone giving back its patient heat, with the woman who had thawed his frozen heart beside him, and the young man he had loved as a son holding his ruined hand. He was not cold. That was the thing. After a whole life spent fighting the cold, in the end, he was warm. And the last thing he saw, they said, was the soft red glow of those river stones around the fire, the ones he had gathered from an icy stream a lifetime ago, still holding the warmth, still giving it back, still keeping their old patient promise long after the flame had gone. Some said, in the years afterward, that he had whispered a name at the very end, a woman's name, soft as a breath, the name of someone he had loved, an ocean and a lifetime ago, and that he had smiled, as if, at last, he were no longer too late. Many winters later, the valley had grown. It was no longer a scattered handful of cabins clinging together against the cold. It had become a true settlement, a place with a heart and a center, full of people who had never known the strange old stonemason at all. And the time came when the old gray tower could no longer stand where it stood. The world had moved around it. A new road was needed, and the tower stood in its path, and there was nothing to be done. So it was decided that the tower would come down. But the people of the valley, the ones who remembered, and the ones who had only heard the stories, could not bear to see those stones simply carted away and scattered. Because by then, everyone knew the story. Everyone knew of the old man who had been laughed at, and the tower that had held the fire, and the winter that had proven the whole valley wrong. And so they made a decision. The stones of the old man's tower, every one he had lifted and carried and turned over in his bare hands, would not be thrown away. They would be gathered up, and they would be built, all of them together, into one great hearth at the very heart of the settlement. A gathering place, a warm center where the whole community could come, in the cold of winter, and sit and be warm together. The stones that had once held the fire for one lonely man would now hold it for everyone. And on the day they set the final stone in place, it was an old man who laid it, a tall, white-haired man with patient hands and quiet eyes, who had once been a small boy in a thin coat, watching a stranger build something strange in a frozen field. Silas Voss was old himself now. He knelt slowly before the great new hearth, the way the old man had once knelt before his ring of foundation stones. He turned the last stone over in his weathered hands, feeling it, finding the face that wanted to face the world. And then he set it gently into place. He rested his palm against it for a long moment, and those who stood near said they heard him murmur something, soft, almost too soft to hear. "You'd have liked this," the old man whispered to the stone. "All of them, warm, together. Nobody left out in the cold." And then he rose, slow and careful, and he stepped back, and he looked at the great warm hearth built from the stones of a tower that the whole world had once called foolish. What that old stonemason had given the valley was never really about stone or fire. He taught them not to laugh at the quiet ones, not to mistake what is familiar for what is true, not to be so certain of their own way that they could not see another's. And he taught them the last thing, the deepest thing. That warmth kept for yourself flickers and fades and dies in the dark. But warmth that is given away multiplies. It passes from hand to hand and heart to heart and house to house, down through the long years, until one small fire, lit by one grieving man in one round tower, has somehow, impossibly, warmed an entire world. The tower is long gone now. But on cold winter nights, in that grown and grateful valley, The people still gather around a great stone hearth at the heart of their home, and the stones still hold the fire, slow and patient and warm, long after the flames have died down. And sometimes, the old ones say, when a child asks why the stones stay warm so long, someone will smile and lay a hand against the gentle heat and tell the story of a stubborn old stonemason who crossed an ocean carrying nothing but his tools and his grief, and who built, out of that grief, a thing so warm that it is keeping people warm still. Because good warmth, like good wisdom, does not die. It waits, patient, quiet, glowing softly in the dark, for the next cold soul who comes in from the storm and needs it.